Hello and welcome to the Music Readings Podcast, a podcast covering a variety of writings on music throughout history. This podcast is for students, scholars, or anyone interested in learning more about the history of music. I'm your host, Robert Cray, a doctoral student currently at Florida State University studying historical musicology. This reading will be covered in two parts. This first episode covers a history of Plato, his Republic, and concepts important for understanding the Strunk excerpt. Plato was born around 429 BCE and died in 347. Known as one of the most prominent ancient Greek philosophers, he may have gotten much of his methods and ideas from his master Socrates, born in 469 BCE and died in 399. His travels led him to Italy, Sicily, and possibly Egypt. He then founded the Academy, in which he started a career as a philosopher about a mile outside of Athens. Plato's writings are not arranged in a systematic format, as Aristotle would later do, but rather in highly poetic and dramatically vivid dialogues. One of his most famous dialogues is The Republic, written around 480 BCE, in which he discusses an organization of the ideal state. The Strunk reading takes an excerpt out of the third book of Plato's Republic, which occurred around 410 BCE, with Plato being around 19 years old, in which Socrates is the main speaker, with others responding to him and making their own remarks. These others include Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus. Plato's overall philosophy is that education and art are paramount, and that music plays a part in this ideal state. He believed that music had a purpose to serve not for entertainment, but rather to help in building a harmonious personality and calming the passions. This idea is generally considered to be the doctrine of ethos. Ethos in music, they believed, is something that could affect human behavior and character. In ancient Greece, it was common to use music to worship deities in distinctly different ways. One was Apollo, the god of the sun, music and poetry in the character of discipline and restraint, and the other being Dionysus, the god of fertility and wine, being characterized as emotional and pleasurable. Some key terms that come out of Plato's dialogues would lay the groundwork for many writings and philosophies for centuries to come. Two of these terms are harmonia and tropos. The plural of these are harmoniae and tropoi. For Plato, harmonia is similar to our contemporary term for style, and tropos similar to the organization of pitches. Tropos is what we would now associate with the modes, though the ancient Greeks linked both terms into their idea of what modes were for them. What we now know as the names of the modes, that is Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, etc., were designations for different regions and cultures in the Greek world of the time. These regions were linked to both the region's harmonia, or style, and the region's general organization of pitches, or tropos. These different species of tropoi would later evolve into what the later Latin writers would regard as the modes as we understand them today. This included Boethius, who wrote many of his works in the early 6th century CE. Instead of the heptatonic scale, that is, 7 notes, the Greeks referred to tetrachords, or that of 4-note scales. Ancient Greek tetrachords will be discussed in greater detail in the episode on Cleonidas's harmonic introduction. Another term important to Plato and the Greeks was the word mellows, being the combination of text, rhythm, and pitches, and how they relate to each other. As Aristides Quintilianus, who lived from the late 3rd century CE to the early 4th century, states that mellows is, quote, in the perfect sense, what is composed of harmonia, rhythm, and diction, and in the more specific sense, as in the science of harmonics, it is the succession of notes dissimilar in high and low pitch, end quote. Quintilianus, in his treatise titled On Music, will be covered more in depth in a later episode. It is important to note when Quintilianus lived and how the philosophies of Plato's time were carried on for over 700 years. One last term which is important in the understanding of ancient Greek music was their definition of who was a musician. A Greek musician was one who understood music in both its scientific and practical forms. In this section of the Republic, it is Glaucon who is the musician who explains much of the technical aspects of music. Scientific aspects of music started with Pythagoras, who died around 500 BCE. Pythagoras introduced the ideas of ratios in music by discovering the octave, fourth, and fifth. This is where the idea of perfect intervals originated. In the next episode, I will be covering more specific aspects of the excerpt by the order in which the speaker's logic is presented. These include the modes, instruments used, rhythms, ethos, education in music, gymnastics, and a summary of their ideas on how it would apply to their ideal state. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Music Readings Podcast. If there are any questions or suggestions for future topics, you can contact me at musicreadingspodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is produced, written, and edited by me, Robert Cray, and is free for use in any educational setting. If you would like to help out the podcast, please share and give any commentary on how it may be improved. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Music Readings Podcast.